We're going to spend a little time with data validation. Currently, the way we are set up, and I'll show you what we're looking at here. If I were to go into the new to-do screen and just hit submit, and then we go and look at our data, you'll see that we were allowed to put in an empty to-do, which is not a good thing. And we actually need to do our data validations in a couple of places to prevent this from happening. You might think that the place to do it most logically or primarily is in the user interface, which is great. We are going to do that. But as we've talked about in prior videos, we also need to make sure that our APIs we're creating don't allow any bad data into our system. And that can't be done at the UI level or at the mobile app level. So we're going to do that at the API level to make sure that fail message is passed back for empty data passed in. And for us, we want both a name and a description. And to do that, I'm going to use the precondition utility function that is used in the login. Here's precondition. We're going to go ahead and save it empty for the moment, and then I want to move it to the top of the function stack. Because we need the precondition to execute before we attempt to add the record. If we left precondition at the bottom, then it wouldn't do us any good. The record would always be added. And what we're going to check on here is we need to make sure name and description have a links to them, that they're not empty. And so the first thing I'm going to show you is if I click on name as an input, there's a configuration at the bottom here that says trim. And what this does is it removes white space from the front and the back. So if somebody were to pass in, let's say, 3 spaces from the interface, without trim, we would consider that to have links, and we would put 3 spaces in the to-do, which will look empty. So we don't want that to happen. And you'll see that also in description, we have the same configuration. That's a default configuration whenever you add text fields as input. So we know that we're getting, if we get any links, it's because there are characters, numbers, whatever, not just spaces. And then for the precondition, what we're going to do is, so a precondition is, if you remember, if not met, then the request, the API call will stop. So the way I look at that is we're going to add information in here that must be met. So what must be met is that the name, and we'll add a filter to it because we want to know something about the name. We're going to check the string length of the name. And so if the length of the name is greater than a constant integer value of 0, then that is passing, and we like that. And then also in addition, and we need to make sure that the description with add filter, same string length function, we're going to do this the exact same way. We want to make sure it's greater than, I'll just scroll all the way to the bottom, pick integer and 0. So at this point, both of these conditions must be true. I must have some value in both name and description. And if I don't, look at that. Sometimes, and I think that's something being worked on, but I just managed to eliminate what I had there. So I'm going to recreate exactly what I did before in very quick fashion because I didn't save it, which is sloppy. I'm going to add string length to this one. And then we want greater than for both of these, and then the integer value for both of them. And we want that integer value to be 0. So we're saying name and description need to have a string length greater than 0. And I guess I could, now that I've saved that, we could put a message here, must have a value for name and description. Okay. We're not going to end up showing that error message at this point, but at least we have something that documents what the precondition is. So let's go ahead and see what we have here. think I'm going to need an auth token, and I don't have one yet. So let's go into a third Xano tab and go into our to-do app, into our APIs, and we are going to do a login so that we have an auth token for our testing as we continue this video. Okay. Run that, grab the token, and then we want to come back to, back to our to-do where we added our precondition. We're now going to do a run and debug, and we're simply going to leave name and description empty. And when we run that, we get our error message that we created, so we know that's working. And then let's say I type in a name, I should still get that error message, and I do. And then one more test. If I do a description without a name, I should still get that error message, and I do. But now if I type in a name and a description, it should work, and it did. Okay, so we now know that our precondition is set up correctly to protect our data on the back end. And there you can see it was created. Go ahead and get rid of that one. Okay, so at this point, you now know that your backend, your Xano backend, will not accept invalid to-do data. But what we would like to do, and actually before I transition, let's come back because we don't have to change anything in our app. And if I hit submit, I get the failed to create the to-do, try again. And that's our toast message showing that when we clicked on submit and did the create record, we got this toast message right here. And the second output node on the create record is the failed, which is because of the precondition and the fact that we had empty name, empty description. So now let's go one step further. I'd actually like to be able to capture that problem, that error, before I submit it back to Xano. We could leave it like this. I mean, it'll work, but there's really no reason to make a call back to the server over the network if we know up front that we want name and description. So for usability, we'll get a much quicker response if we go ahead and check the length of name and description before we hit submit. And I learned something prior that I'm going to show here. I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell on a condition that I didn't realize existed until I attempted this earlier. When I come into this screen and I type nothing, these name and description fields don't give me, they're undefined. And so there's some things that don't work correctly. So let me show you what that looks like, and it'll make sense when we do our validation. Let's say length of name. And I'm going to create a formula that checks the length of, get that in the right spot, data variable name. And the reason that I am checking that is because we're going to see, after I save this, that initially when I come into the screen, so I'm going to go into the new to-do screen, and I'm going to hit submit. And if you see length of name, there's no number below that. And what I'd really expect to see is a 0. Like in this case, I see a 1. If I add a bunch more, I see 6. So I'm getting the length, but when we first come into the screen, that is, see, and now I can empty it out and it sees it as 0. It's officially an empty screen or an empty field. But when I first came in, see if we can get rid of this screen. There we go. So let me go back in and hit submit. There is no value. So we need to account for that in our edit check that we're going to do. And I wanted to show you that so you have the context, and you can do that experiment on your own to see it. But I now know that when I first come in, if I were to hit submit, the length function would not be a valid check. Okay, so knowing that, we're going to wire up an if condition that is going to be a check when we tap the submit button. We come through the component tap event, and the first thing we're going to do is validate that name and description are in a condition that we're willing to submit those back to the server. And as you remember, the top output node is true, which means if the condition is true, we want to create the record. And if it's false, we want to give an error message of must have a name and description. And then we're also going to add, just so we don't forget for later, the app variable that is the toast position that we've been using, so that our toast shows up in the middle of the screen. Okay, so we've wired up the basics. So if it works, it'll go to create record. And if it doesn't work, the user will get a message and will stay on the screen that we're at, and we'll leave the data as it is so that they can fix it. So now what we need to do, as opposed to having a static value there, we're going to come in and create a formula in an if condition. And this formula needs to end with a true or false value. If it's true, we'll create the record. So the first thing I want to do is trim white space of the data variable that is name. And this is the reason we talked about before. We need to make sure somebody doesn't just pass empty spaces back. And then I'm going to add in a length check of that trimmed white space. So we trim the white space, and number type is not assignable to true, false. Okay, so it's not happy yet because I have to do my condition. Like I said, this needs to return a true, false value only. And right now it thinks it's returning a number. So I want to make sure that the length is greater than 0. That means there is a non-space character or number for the name. I either need that to be greater than 0, or, which is those two vertical bars, that stands for or. You can do searches on logic operator or, and you'll see those for JavaScript. Or I want to know that, look at this utility function here. Let's come down to utility so we know it's not just magic. I want to use is empty. And if I look at that, it's going to return true or false based on the given value is empty. So in this case, it will, since it's asking is empty, and it is in our case when we first come into the screen, it's going to return true for that. But I don't consider that a valid condition. Let's get this built out real quick and I'll explain for name. If name is empty, it's considered bad, so I want to negate that so that my error check works correctly. So right now, if I have a greater than 0, I'm good, or if I'm not empty, I'm good. Okay, and now I need to do that exact same thing for description. But before we do that, we're going to test and make sure that this works for us. So I've got the condition set up. We're going to save it. So what we should see if I've set this up correctly on our app, there we go, refresh, we're going into the new to-do. I'm going to leave name untouched, and I'm just going to hit submit. There it is. So I get my message. And if I just put in spaces, failed to create the to-do. So I think, and if it's empty like this, it's not, there we go. Okay. So now I need to repeat that same process for the description. So let's go back into our if and into our formula. And I'm going to put parentheses around this because I want that to be all done together. And then I'm going to copy it because I need an and condition, and I need this to be true for description. So we will change name to description in both cases. And now, when I component tap, I'm going to check to make sure name and description have values. If they do, they will go to create record. If they do not, they will do must have a name and description. Okay. Let's save it before we test it. Okay. Go into the new to-do and hit submit. Must have a name and description. And then if I put in spaces, I still am good there. Spaces. Okay, so now let's make sure we can still create one. Test, real test, and submit. Okay, if you notice, it cleared it out like we had logic in before. And if I come back over to here, you'll see the only one I have is the one that is valid. And so we'll get rid of that for now since it's just test data. So now we've actually got a well-protected user interface and a well-protected backend. Let's go one step further, because sometimes this is more usability than anything else, because we really have all the checks we need. But now I have the ability with the submit button. There's no reason to even have that enabled if the data isn't set up correctly. So we're going to go one step further, because in your app, if you want disabled to be a dynamic field, we can come into the formula, and we're going to do something very similar to what we did before, except we need to consider the value we're passing back, because this is disabled, and I want it to be true, disabled, if the length of a white space name is less than or equal to 0, or if it is empty. So it's kind of the reverse of what we had on the prior one. So let's get our trim white space of a data variable name. And then let's put a length check on that, where it needs to be less than or equal to 0. Okay, so that means disabled will be true if it's 0 or less than. It won't really be less than, but it's just kind of a safety catch to make sure that if it's empty, we're good. And we also want to say or, like we did before, is empty, and data variable name. We don't negate this one because disabled true is what we're looking for. So at this point, I have a valid check on name. So let's go ahead, or is empty. I think I do. No, I don't. Okay, let me check my parentheses. I've got one for is empty, and I've got one. Yeah, let me clean this up a little bit. I'm going to get rid of these so that I can match them up again. So my parentheses were a little off. I want to make sure I have that right before I leave the screen. This one is for is empty. And then this one is white space. If I click on length, you'll see that that one takes to length. And then I'm going to wrap one around the whole condition for length. And then I'm going to wrap a parenthesis around everything, because we'll need that when I add in the description part. So I've got, at this point, the ability, when I save this and we go look at our new screen, our new to-do screen, you'll notice that I can't submit. It's dimmed out, and as I click on it, nothing happens. But what should happen is when I type one character in submit, or in, you'll notice it became available. And when I So if you notice, I've got control now visually that they can't click that button at all. So we don't have to do anything, and it'll stay disabled until I enter data. And so I want to do that same thing for the description field. So that would be and. So I need an and there because I want both name and description to meet these conditions. I'm going to just copy and paste because there's no reason to retype that. We've got description instead of name, and we'll copy and paste it over here. Okay. Let's do our check. We'll go back into our new to-do screen. We can't submit. Even if I type in, oh, I broke it because I shouldn't be able to submit. Obviously, my other user interface checks stop it, but my submit button should not click on submit. Go look at this disabled. I've got something messed up here. So it worked for name, but it's not working for description. So I'm saying that if length trim white space of name is less than or equal to 0 or is empty, so if it is empty or if it's less than or equal to 0, that's a true. And then and the length trim white space of description is less than or equal to 0 or is empty description. Don't you hate it when it looks like it's right, but it's not working right? So if this one is true, either of these is true and it is empty or it's less than or equal to 0, it'll be disabled. And then, oh, I know why. It's not an and condition, I don't think. I think it's an or. Because if either of these, that is, you gotta love it. If either of these, right, if this first section is true, then I need it to be disabled. Or, not and, but or, if this section is true, I need it to be disabled. So let's redo that with the or condition and give it another test. Okay, so I cannot submit, it's disabled. I type this in, it's disabled. If I type here, it's enabled, which is right because I have values in both. And if I eliminate it, it stays disabled, even if, there we go. So now I'm disabled unless they're both there. And I'll submit and clear, and we'll come back here and make sure that we got all the way back to the server, and we did. Okay, almost there. One last little thing to make this more usable, because there's really no reason to sit on this blank screen after we've submitted. I think the normal action people would expect is that screen should close. So after I submit, I'm going to come over to my function logic, and I am going to, only on success, I'm going to navigate back. So now, if I come into the new to-do and I say, do homework, before dinner, and I submit this, it's going to blank and then go back to my list if everything's good. There we go. Okay, so now we have our new to-do at the bottom. I think that's everything we need to do on this one. That was validation of new to-dos so that your data does not get screwed up, and we did it at an API level, and we did it 2 different ways on the user interface. I'm kind of a big fan of doing the disabled button because it's a nice visual for people to see. that they still have data to enter. So we're going to get rid of that one. It looks like we're going to be adding in the next video, we're going to be adding a picture to the to-do, which I think actually that'll be kind of fun, because that will mean that the list here will start showing pictures. And you can imagine taking a picture of dirty dishes, mowing the lawn, a book for homework, anything that adds a little thing visual to it. So hang in there with me, and the next time we get to do some more image uploads and associating that with each of the to-dos.